Thank you, everybody. That was a very effective photo opportunity. Welcome to the Effective Development Cooperation Summit. Excellencies, President Cassis, President Kagame, President Sandhu, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General, the senior representatives in this room from international organizations, the private sector, academia, civil society, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. And of course, welcome to those of you who are joining us remotely. My name is Claire Doul, and I'm your MC. We only have 7 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not on track. More effective development cooperation is needed now as we face multiple challenges of conflict, climate change, and economic recession. This summit is going to talk about the how we do cooperation more effectively. How do we get trust back? How do we get the SDG agenda back on track? I would also like to introduce Priyanti Fernando, who is joining us remotely, and who is the Executive Director of the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, a feminist organization based in the Global South, committed to the full realization of women's rights. Thank you for joining us remotely. It's being live streamed, it's being recorded. You're going to get some of the answers to those questions in English, French, and Spanish. Please do tweet. You see the hashtag there. But with no further ado, I would now like to give the floor to Raj Kumar, who is the author of the book, The Business of Changing the World. He's also CEO and editor-in-chief of DevEx, which is the leading independent news organization for global development. And Raj is going to set the scene and tell us about some of the challenges that the world is facing. Raj, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's an honor to be with all of you today. I don't think I've ever been in a room with so many SDG pins, even with Amina Mohammed here. This is a group that clearly agrees on the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and the importance of aid effectiveness. And in fact, I'll give you a little sneak preview to the DevEx newsletter that's coming out any minute now as we cover this conference. Our editors have called this the Swiss schmooze because people are so friendly, they're so much in agreement around this issue. But I want to put a little pressure on us this morning. I think about the Moroccan victory in the World Cup, and some of you may have seen the tweet that has gone around saying, "Congratulations, Morocco." Please, congratulations. Now the entire fate of the Global South rests on your shoulders, no pressure. Well, we should feel some of that pressure here ourselves, because I think we're at a real crossroads. Now, I was in Busan in 2011. I'm sure many of you were there as well. And I want to emphasize that the agenda behind aid effectiveness was not meant to simply be a tweak of an existing system. It was designed to be, and over these last 2 decades, a fundamental transformation, akin to going from gas-guzzling cars to electric vehicles. We're talking about changing the sector from being top-down and project-based to really being bottoms-up and systems-based. It's a fundamental transformation, and it comes down to a simple question. Who are we trying to serve? How do we see the problem we're trying to solve? You know, before Busan, we might have said, well, this gentleman, Mr. Happy Letsitsa, who's a farmer in South Africa, we might have said he's a beneficiary. And so we need to provide him with a project or a program to support him. But actually, I came across this farmer in an article about crop insurance. It turns out that 80% of smallholder farmers in South Africa don't have access to the crop insurance market, and as droughts are expanding, there's a need for this. So if we see this same farmer more as a citizen or a partner, it changes the frame of what we're even trying to do when we think about aid. Now, let's talk about the aid effectiveness agenda and where we are. How far have we come? And I've got 4 quick measures to take us through to give us a sense of how we've done since Busan. One is about fragmentation, and this might look a little bit like the waiting rooms for some of the ministers in the audience in recipient countries. There was a statistic provided by the World Bank that showed that back in 2009, 55% of aid recipient countries had more than 60 donor entities represented there. That means if you met with each donor on average once a quarter, not a single day would go by without a meeting with the donor agency. That was the case for more than half recipient countries. By 2019, it had grown to 78%. So a massive burden on recipient countries. What about Tide Aid, something we've heard a lot about over many years now since the Paris Declaration? Well, there's been real progress in many countries, but the overall Development Assistance Committee numbers, the average is still over half of aid is tied. And there may have been real progress on the rules around untying, but the de facto reality is the majority is tied. And in some donor countries, even very large ones, the UK, Japan, the United States, a very high percentage, sometimes over 80% of aid remains tied to donor country suppliers. Country ownership is maybe the most fundamental question when it comes to aid effectiveness. How much aid is controlled by donors? How much is controlled by the countries themselves? This was a key part of the Busan Agenda, that countries should have their own strategy for development and be in the driver's seat of it. Well, the Center for Global Development crunched the numbers and found that 2/3 of aid still, this is as of 2020, is controlled by donors. 2/3. So real progress, certainly, over the last 2 decades of the aid effectiveness agenda, but a long way to go. Finally, when we think about trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, a key element reiterated over and over is we've got to get private investment to align with these goals. Well, how much of the ODA budget is actually designed to bring private sector investment along? As of 2019, it was 2% that went toward blended finance instruments. Now, the people who are in these industry groups say it's growing, but it's likely still at a single-digit percentage of ODA going to crowding in private sector investment. So the needs, as I don't have to tell all of you, when it comes to the development sector, are growing. In fact, this is just one element of the broader use of ODA. This is the humanitarian needs around the world. And look at how quickly they are scaling. There's probably not a country represented in this room that hasn't seen dramatic effects from the climate, from conflict. And you can see just this year alone, if we were to actually meet the humanitarian needs as requested by the UN, it would take 1/3 of global ODA. So the needs are growing, but funding is plateauing. Back in the Cold War era, aid levels were relatively high. Aid effectiveness was not on the agenda. The Cold War might have been good for aid levels, but it was terrible for aid effectiveness. As we came out of the Cold War, we saw aid levels begin to drop. This is ODA per capita, data from the World Bank across all lower and middle income countries. Well, then we hit the year 2000, and it became kind of a golden era for global development. The world was globalizing. There was a sense that problems anywhere are problems everywhere. Global economy was growing, trade was increasing, and ODA budgets began to be supported by all political groups around the world. And you started to see a dramatic consensus behind this that grew through the 2000s, even past the global financial crisis, and even through the Euro crisis and some of the civil war in Syria and many other major challenges saw ODA levels continuing to creep up, but they began to plateau sort of at the middle of the last decade. The political consensus started to shift, especially as many more migrants came to the borders of the US and of Europe, as donors began to prioritize their budgets towards supporting refugees within their borders. You began to see the political calculus behind ODA change. I don't need to tell many of you in this room that. And including in some countries, the UK is a good example. DevEx reported just last week, 30% cuts to the foreign aid budget. So you're beginning to see a plateau. Of course, 2020 is included, and it looks like a spike up during COVID, but the broader trend is a plateau, maybe even a decline. So that brings us to this crossroads. What is this decision that we actually have to make? Well, the global context is shifting a lot. We're in a period now where we went from globalization to perhaps deglobalization. We see conflict right here in Europe. We see geopolitics coming front and center, a real competition between the West and China as just one example, and what that might mean for a deglobalizing period and what that might mean for all of us at ODA. We're seeing a period maybe that's going to be characterized by slower growth, by higher inflation, by higher interest rates. This is going to put pressure on donor governments. The precious dollars and euros that are committed to foreign assistance may come under more pressure even than we've seen so far. And developing countries may find it harder amid debt crisis to raise funds from the private markets as well. And of course, all of this is happening at a moment when we need trillions for a massive historic energy transition. So what does it mean within the development sector? Well, the humanitarian crises, as I showed you, they're growing, and that trend does not look like it's going to change. If you talk to most experts in the humanitarian field, they strongly believe we will see more crises, more conflicts, and they'll be more protracted. In addition to that, we've seen ODA is flat or declining in some places. And the private investment that is growing, ESG, investment in impact, it's growing, but it's leaving many behind. Much private investment is not focused on low-income countries. It's not aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. There is some good news, though. Since we met in Busan in 2011, a lot has actually shifted in our sector, not just our understanding, but our tools. For example, many country systems are in a much better position to take funding directly and to absorb it. Localization has become a much bigger trend, including in the private philanthropy space. There are many more local CSOs, national NGOs that are far more robust than a decade ago and ready to step up if funding is provided. Pay-for-results instruments have become much more common. In terms of private capital, de-risking private capital is possible with lots of new financial innovative instruments. And the social enterprise sector, I'm sure there's some social entrepreneurs in this audience today, has become much more robust. There are thousands of social enterprises around the world ready to be supported and to unlock private capital in their markets. And there is a historic opportunity to go directly to people like the farmer, Mr. Letitsa, I showed earlier, through cash transfers, through financial inclusion, through digital connectivity and IDs. So we are in a very different position than we were before. But fundamentally, it comes back to the idea that are we making a slow, steady, iterative transition toward aid effectiveness? Something we can all agree on is important. Aid effectiveness is always important. But in this context, I think we see that aid effectiveness is essential, not just important. And the question facing all of us at this crossroads is, are we going to make a much more determined and quick effort to get there? We are delighted to be media partners for this event. You'll see DevEx reporters here covering the sessions that we're doing, interviewing many of you. And I look forward to interacting with all of you during this session. Those of you who are online, on Twitter, and here in person, tell us what you're seeing in terms of these trends and what you're doing about them. Thank you so much, and good morning.
Thank you, Raj. And indeed, the needs are growing, but the funding is plateauing, as we know. I would now very much like to ask our very high-level speakers to join me on stage. His Excellency Ignacio Cassis, President of the Swiss Confederation, please join me. His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda and Chair of the African Union Development Agency, Sir. Her Excellency Maya Sandu, President of the Republic of Moldova. Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And Vitalis Meja, a co-chair of the Effective Development Cooperation Summit and Executive Director of Reality of Aid Africa, a Pan-African initiative that aims to contribute to more effective international aid. Thank you. We are also joined by Priyanti Fernando, Executive Director of the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, a feminist organization based in the Global South that is really committed to the full realization of women's rights. Thank you. I would now like to ask the President of the Confederation to open as our host and go to the lectern and to say a few words. Thank you, sir.
President Sandhu, President Kagame, Deputy Secretary General Mohammed, distinguished ministers, high representatives of governments, local authorities, multilateral organizations, the private sector, and civil society, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for accepting my invitation to this high-level conference to question what we do, to relentlessly improve the way we do it, to commit to sustainable development despite pressing crises. This is what we owe to our citizens today and to future generations. As we meet here in Geneva, war is raging less than 2,000 kilometers away, adding to the existing armed conflicts in at least 46 states and the 150,000 fatalities in 2021. The return of war to our doorstep confronts us with a harsh reality. The ideal of a peaceful and democratic world was an illusion. Even in Europe, where we believe that war would never again find a place after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Do you remember Francis Fukuyama's The End of History? Perhaps we have been too complacent in Europe, as many colleagues around the world have made clear to me. The fact is that we were wrong. Today, some nations are nostalgic for their glorious past, and regional powers want to have their say. War, protectionism, and nationalism are taking root, while new challenges require urgent multilateral solutions. I'm thinking, for instance, of energy shortages, food insecurity, rising inflation, and climate change, of course. We are all dependent on each other. Turning away from international bodies and taking the risk of pitting entire regions against each other is a very dangerous trend. Withdrawal is not a solution. Even worse, it is the very negation of our inherent advantages. International Geneva, which welcomes you today, has taught us that unity is strength. What differentiates us should not divide us, but enrich us. Common values and a mutual respect are our compass. We must take responsibility and act together. This is the raison d'être of the global partnership. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let us return to the values of the 2030 Agenda and redouble our joint efforts to implement it. This is about trust and acting together to build that trust. We need to work innovatively, pushing the boundaries of our traditional disciplines, such as development cooperation and humanitarian aid. Sometimes I get angry when I see how we get lost in unnecessary disagreements instead of looking beyond the horizon. We need to act on evidence and be able to critically evaluate what we do, to learn from our mistakes. New technologies will come to our aid here. But how can we manage it? Facta, non verba. You might know this Latin expression better as actions speak louder than words. if we truly need to do something and are simply not taking action, the solution is act now. And to act effectively, we must set goals and rely on data. The 21st century is founded on science diplomacy. Today we are confronted with the convergence of the sciences. We are seeing an incredible scientific and technological acceleration which impacts humankind, society, and the planet. We need to explore what is emerging in laboratories and predict its benefits to humans while minimizing the risks of abuse, based on the motto, use the future to build the present. Right here in Geneva, home of CERN and an ecosystem of diplomatic and scientific excellence, Switzerland has established a foundation whose purpose is precisely to anticipate the impact that new technologies will have on humanity, to maximize their benefits and minimize their risks. Its name is GESDA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, GESDA.global. This anticipatory science diplomacy is a core element of Switzerland's foreign policy. Against the background of a geopolitical reality that drives us apart, we believe that anticipatory science diplomacy can invigorate and strengthen the purpose of multilateral governance. Part of our commitment at this summit must therefore be to strengthen statistical and informational systems multilaterally and at the national level, and better connect them to reduce our blind spots. The language of scientific evidence speaks to everyone. Let us use it to stand up for our values and create a better world. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the halfway mark to 2030, and we are not really on track. Moreover, multilateralism retains all its relevance, even when confronted with the trends of deglobalization and a multipolar world. Multilateralism, ladies and gentlemen, is us. It is the expression of our nations, of our time. A romantic vision serves no purpose. We must be able to adapt it to a changing world and to revitalize it in this new reality. Exactly as we do with our countries and our national institutions. Because however we organize ourselves, the planet is one, and humanity faces challenges. I am thinking first and foremost of the climate challenge that only strong, evidence-based and data-driven international cooperation can solve. As a newly elected non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, Switzerland will focus on that. Let this high-level conference send a clear and loud message of joint commitment to sustainable development and an effective, principle-based development cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. President, for that call to the return of the values of the 2030 Agenda. I would now like to give the floor to Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations.
Thank you. Your Excellency, President Kassis of the Swiss Federation, Your Excellency, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda and Chair of the AU-NEPAD, Your Excellency, President of Moldova, and my colleague, Mr. Vitalice Mesha, who is coming from Reality of Aid and also the co-chair of the GPEDC, Excellencies, many friends in the audience, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank President Cassis for hosting this really important summit. It gives us an opportunity at the end of a very trying year to harvest what we see as opportunities for next year, given the huge challenges that we have faced. Addressing world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly in September, the Secretary General issued an SOS for the Sustainable Development Goals. Emerging from COP27 and on the heels of the AU-UN partnership, it is also clear that while some progress is being made, including the historic agreement to establish a fund for loss and damage, we are still far from being on track. Development cooperation must be able to support countries moving forward on transitions to a sustainable and prosperous future, especially on green energy, access, creating resilient food systems, and leveraging digital advances for the benefit of all. Surging conflicts, rising geopolitical tensions, disruption to supply chains, and a devastating food crisis, all narrowing fiscal space, declining public trust, and the fallout from the climate emergency really have combined to create a superstorm with disastrous consequences for millions of people across the world. For the first time since it was established in 1990, the UNDP Human Development Index has declined for 2 years in a row. At the midpoint of the SDGs, it is clear that a radical shift is needed if we are to keep the promise of 2015, a promise of dignity, of opportunity, of rights, and peace for all on a healthy planet. This calls for greater urgency, greater solidarity, and certainly greater ambition. But above all, it calls for transformation. Transformation of what we do, protecting the most vulnerable, pursuing urgent economic transitions, investing in people, and reforming the international financial system. And transformation of how we do it, the mindsets that we bring to the table, and the role of development cooperation and its quality, sense of scale and urgency. All these will be critical, and it is what brings us here today. We all recognize that the old traditional North-South aid models are simply just not enough and are an inadequate response to the scale of the challenges that we are facing today. We also know bilateral aid alone will not deliver the type of impact at scale that can achieve the SDGs, especially when we see many bilateral programs remain loosely coordinated or not anchored in national priorities. Of concern, despite efforts to fulfilling ODA obligations, which has saved lives and millions of livelihoods, many countries are increasingly diverting funding away from long-term development goals towards immediate crisis-related needs, including within donor countries themselves. At a time of surging and mutually reinforcing crises, we need additionality and the alignment of financing with the SDGs, not creative repurposing. While we expect developing countries to embark upon integrated, inclusive, multi-stakeholder development processes, we also know that this is a shifting and a fragmented landscape across donors, civil society, the private sector, philanthropies, and more. And so it is time for development actors to rethink the way they work in order to lift the burden of achieving the SDGs by 2030 and enable an inclusive and fair international system that can withstand shocks and deliver peace and prosperity. We need to look at ODA with a new mindset, where developed countries invest in development outcomes with a focus of enabling transformation and sustainability through our domestic budgets, catalyzing other sources of funding, and investing together to achieve the goals. Small, fragmented projects are no longer going to make the cut. The scale of what we have to address is too much. And we need greater transparency across all ODA sectors to ensure we are measuring what we want to manage. And in doing so, moving away from the narrow GDP-centric measurements to truly capturing vulnerabilities across all nations. Excellencies, as stressed by the Secretary General in his call for an SDG stimulus, this will require reforming our broken global financial architecture. Designed many decades ago, we need to address the immediate needs of countries. In the near term, development actors must work together to create the additional fiscal space needed for countries to invest in recovery, including by better leveraging lending from multilateral development banks and public development banks, reinstating and improving upon the debt service suspension initiative, rechanneling all unused special drawing rights, among others. We must also work to enhance affordable credit and significantly lower the cost of borrowing, especially as developing countries who routinely pay upwards of 7 to 8% on their loans compared to around 1 to 4% for much of the Western world. In the long term, these efforts must be aimed at preparing the world for future shocks and facilitating just transitions, including by aligning all forms of finance with the SDGs and utilizing innovative tools such as country cooperation frameworks and integrated national financing frameworks to ensure that they are aligned with country-specific priorities. Excellencies, today's challenges require collective action that is country-led, result-oriented, inclusive, and transparent. Put simply, we need multilateralism that delivers for all people. Initiatives such as a Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation are critical. We recognize and appreciate the leadership of OECD DAC in driving the ongoing reform of the partnership to shift focus of effectiveness to the country level, including through greater collaboration with the UNRC and UN country teams. All of these essential. As you take this forward in the coming days and months, allow me to highlight 3 issues for your reflections. First, the commitment of the UN development system. As Raj spoke to fragmentation, it is one of the issues that we've taken seriously in trying to get the UN funds and programs to act as one. Over the past 5 years, we have worked with member states and our development partners to be fit to respond to the complex demands of the 2030 Agenda. Under that leadership of an empowered resident coordinator, united around a UN cooperation framework and new generation of country teams, all positioned to support the drive for effective development cooperation. But it needs the support of donors to help and ensure that we are funding a one plan, a one set of priorities to achieve the SDGs. Resident coordinators and UN country teams are bringing all stakeholders to the table to forge transformative partnerships around countries' national development needs and priorities. And this was particularly apparent as countries grappled with the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and as the UN development system redoubled its efforts to support an attainable recovery. It is increasingly visible on the critical transitions that are now underway on energy, on food systems, on education, and on digitalization. Second, I would urge us all to focus on the effectiveness of development spending. It is clear that development assistance and other sources of international financing are currently failing to meet the needs of developing countries today. It is essential that development resources are aligned with national needs and priorities in the most efficient manner possible. We are working hand in hand with partners such as the EU to ensure that our collective expertise is better pooled and used to support our common ambition. At the same time, that contributes to greater coherence, efficiency and effectiveness of development assistance. And these are all key pillars of the Global Partnership for Effective Cooperation, Development Cooperation. Third and last, supporting national leadership. People, particularly the most vulnerable, must be at the center of our development approaches. In our report of our common agenda, the Secretary General noted that to deliver on the promise of 2030, partnerships need to be grounded in a renewed social contract and to fully engage all parts of society, especially our women and our girls. Excellencies, the SDG Summit next year will be an opportunity and a turning point for the SDG implementation. We must create a new sense of urgency and momentum so that we can ensure development cooperation not only delivers, but it delivers at scale with a sense of urgency. Development as an emergency. I wish you the very best in the discussions, and you can count on the support of the UN development system as we move forward in what will hopefully be a transformative journey to delivering on the SDGs in 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General, for that support to the global partnership. I would now like to give the floor to the President of Rwanda and Chair of the African Union Development Agency, Paul Kagame.
Excellency, President Kassis of the Swiss Federation, Excellency Mayor Sandu, President of the Republic of Moldova, Excellency Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, co-chairs of Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be joining you for the opening of the 2022 Effective Development Cooperation Summit. 7 years ago, the world put its differences aside and united over a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals for building more prosperous and peaceful societies for all. The Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation brought us even closer together in our quest for better outcomes. I wish to commend you for keeping the flame of effective development cooperation principles alive. This is no small feat when the landscape of development cooperation is under unprecedented strain with the COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tensions, and a global downturn. But we have to maintain the urgency to get back on track for the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Progress remains slow, and in some cases, it is reversing. The guiding principles of putting country ownership first, focusing on results and mutual accountability are more relevant than ever. And this is really because we should be learning lessons from what works and what doesn't work, and why. We just can't be repeating ourselves over and over, stressing very important points, and yet not moving forward on them. But with some reports indicating that the cost of meeting the SDGs targets has increased by up to 25%, new ways of doing things, especially in mobilizing resources and partnerships, are needed. One area that requires special effort is better resource mobilization among recipients. For example, following a similar emphasis on agriculture, the African Union has made increased domestic financing for national health systems a priority, and is tracking this on an annual basis. I'm pleased to note the participation of Nados Bekele, our Chief Executive Director of AUDA NEPAD, on the Extended Steering Committee of the Global Partnership. Development effectiveness is also about keeping track of progress, identifying gaps, and making adjustments where needed. In line with this, I welcome the new monitoring framework, which will include an assessment of the private sector's engagement as a key player in the development cooperation. Finally, the lessons of the pandemic and current global uncertainties are teaching us that everyone, rich and poor, is affected when there is a breakdown in trust. That includes trust between development partners and recipients. Building a robust framework for trust has been the goal of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation since its establishment more than a decade ago. Development cooperation that is more inclusive and open to innovative partnerships and that delivers for the people who need it most is one way to build resilient systems nationally, regionally, and globally. Now, more than ever, we need to be focused and remain committed to our promises of delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. We look forward to continue working together and staying the course. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and indeed, we all need new ways of thinking and new ways of working together. I would now like to give the floor to the President of Moldova, Maia Sandu.
President Cassis, President Kagame, distinguished audience, thank you for having me at the launch of the Effective Development Cooperation Summit. I'm humbled to be in a room full of individuals representing states, organizations, communities, civil society, the private sector, people who are committed to making progress in poverty reduction and human development in their respective countries and across the globe. Yet, how come when there is so much will, means, and resources available, we are still off track in achieving a better living for the majority of our people? We are slow in achieving SDGs. What are we missing? As we are faced with ever more complex challenges, how can we increase the effectiveness of the development tools we will use to address them? These questions have answers. They might be different depending on where we stand, but we have them. What we need is more solidarity, trust, a more open dialogue with each other. We need development solutions that are better tailored to the challenges faced by different countries. We need to work closer and better together. I would like to share with you 3 recent experiences of my country, the Republic of Moldova, in how we deal with unprecedented and interlinked challenges that alone we are not prepared to face, despite the strong political will to change things for the better for our citizens. First, the pandemic. The world, as we know it, was put to the test by the COVID-19 pandemic. Countries struggled to keep the sanitary crisis in check and get vaccines for their citizens, while the world economy took a massive hit, its consequences we can feel still today. In December 2020, when the world was already providing vaccines to the first-line responders and to the most vulnerable, there was no light at the end of the tunnel for Moldova. Immediately after we came to power, my team and I made extensive efforts to secure vaccine deliveries to our country of under 3 million people, a market of no interest to vaccine producers during a time of scarce supply and fierce competition for the job. But we called persistently on our international partners, and they delivered. In an act of extraordinary solidarity, Moldova got a first batch of vaccines from neighboring and friendly Romania in February 2021. Soon after, we were the first country in Europe to receive a vaccine donation via the COVAX platform. Thanks to our strong determination and relationship of trust that we built with our partners, with our international partners, we were able to start vaccination in Moldova in March 2021 and save many lives. Second, the war. In February 2022, as many countries were still grappling with the effects of the pandemic, Russia attacked the very core of the international rules-based order, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another country, Ukraine, our neighbor and friend. This brutal, unjust, and unprovoked war also profoundly affects my country. On the morning of the February 24, thousands of Ukrainians, mostly women, children, and elderly, started lining up at our border, fleeing from the Russian bombs that were falling on their homes. This was the first refugee crisis we had to deal with in our history. Moldovans and the international organizations were unprepared for what was to come. But the Moldovan people followed their intrinsic values and instincts. They opened up their hearts and homes to help all Ukrainians who needed shelter. Central institutions, local governments and communities, our diaspora, civil society, development partners, and the private sector mobilized and worked closely together to put in place proper mechanisms to welcome all who needed a roof and a hot meal. That system was not ideal. It wasn't always as rapid as we envisioned it. But it worked. It worked because the government, civil society, and our international partners and donors trusted each other. And because from day one, the government was transparent and comprehensive about their needs regarding the refugee assistance and about the use of resources. Nearly 700,000 Ukrainians passed through Moldova since the beginning of this war, for a population of 2.6 million people. This is more than a quarter of our population. Over 80,000 of them are still in Moldova today. Half of them are children. Many of them live with regular Moldovan families. Donors funded programs to help integrate refugees by facilitating employment, learning Romanian language, ensuring access to online education for Ukrainian children, and other measures. Transparency and trust also helped us step up our cooperation in the field of security with our international partners, primarily with the European Union and its member states. Our border guards now work alongside Frontex officers to secure our borders and prevent human, arms, and drugs trafficking stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Third, the energy crisis. As Moldova now braces for a hard winter caused by an unprecedented energy crisis, we are working side by side with our partners to handle this challenge. We want to ensure that our citizens have affordable access to gas, heating, and electricity this winter. For this, the government put together in a record time a credible system of identifying those most vulnerable who need government support. This was instrumental in setting up a credible energy vulnerability reduction fund to help compensate for the excessively high energy costs incurred by our citizens due to the anomalies on the spot market. The Energy Vulnerability Fund helps us address the energy crisis. Friends like the EU, Germany, France, Sweden, the United States, and others offered loans, grants, and direct budget support to help Moldova get through the winter. We are grateful for their help. In April, Germany, together with France and Romania, set up a unique solidarity mechanism, the Moldova Support Platform, which brings together partners and friends to help Moldova overcome the multiple crises triggered by the war. Ladies and gentlemen, during the last 2 years, my team and I have done everything possible to regain the trust of our international partners that previous corrupt governments managed to lose. Working together, side by side, to tackle these interlinked challenges has made our development cooperation more effective, with impact reaching every citizen. During all this time, we maintained a transparent and open dialogue with our partners, backed by a strong political will to consolidate democracy and to help our citizens live better lives. The experiences that strengthened our international partnerships also convinced member states of the European Union to grant us in June the candidate status to join the EU. Today, the Moldovan government is committed to implementing reforms for EU integration, including reform of public administration, which will improve the capacity of national systems. We will continue reducing transaction costs for development aid. We also promote regular information sharing between government, development partners, civil society, and private sector as key to improve coordination and effective partnerships. We want to improve the efficiency of the assistance provided by inviting civil society and the private sector to participate in determining the priorities of development assistance and its monitoring, and by making information about assistance transparent and accessible. Moldova is working towards a future in the community of European nations as part of the free world. The country is changing. That's what our citizens expect from their government, and that's what we strive to deliver. In a world of ever more complex challenges, doing it alone is not an option. Moldova is committed to a democratic path of development, and in this transformation, we count on the help of our partners. Champions of reform need support if they are to continue on their path and inspire others. Champions of democracy need the consistent support of their international partners. I call on the international community to continue its support to Ukraine, to help it prevail and remain part of the free world. As the country defends its independence and fights to restore its territorial integrity, Ukrainians also defend our freedom. They defend the whole Europe. Switzerland, our host today, has been by our side for the last 3 decades to help develop our country, build our local infrastructure, support educational and cultural projects, and fund projects to empower our youth. President Cassis, Moldovans are grateful for this generous support. Ladies and gentlemen, for years, Moldova missed opportunities to develop in a sustainable, transparent, and accountable manner. Today, we are committed to our own progress, and we are determined to advance our national development agenda in a responsible and transparent manner. In this effort, we count on the help and support of our friends in the international community. To them I say, today you have a partner you can trust in Chisinau. On behalf of the Moldovan people, I express my gratitude to all our international partners for the help and solidarity offered during utmost difficult times. Your aid makes a big difference for my country, helping us advance on needed reforms, strengthen our institutions, introduce new services for the most vulnerable, promote progressive policies in the economy or the environment, and change our citizens' lives for better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and indeed sharing the Moldovan experience and showing that transparency and trust does produce effective results. I would now like to give the floor to one of the co-chairs of the summit and Executive Director of Reality of Aid Africa, Vitalis Meja. The floor is yours.
Your Excellency, President Ignazio Cassis, President of the Swiss Confederation, Your Excellency, President Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda, Your Excellency, President Maya Sandu, President of the Republic of Moldova, Her Excellency, Madam Amina Mohamed, Deputy Secretary General, United Nations, Ms. Priyanthi Famando, Executive Director, International Human Rights Action for Asia Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates. It is indeed my honor to be among you today to give opening address at this important meeting of Effective Development Cooperation Summit. The ongoing pandemic and the global conflicts are worsening poverty. They are undermining growth and jeopardizing the prospects of a resilient and inclusive development for those most left behind. Poor countries are struggling with falling government revenues, increasing debt levels, and dropping literacy rates. At the household level, after years of decline, hunger is on the rise again, returning to the levels from a decade that we had long forgotten. The livelihoods of the poor and the most vulnerable are affected the most. In the absence of a decisive policy action, extreme weather shocks could exacerbate growth and demographic challenges and could lead indeed to an additional 100 million people falling into extreme poverty by 2030. At the same time, the post-COVID recovery efforts is driving up public borrowing and reducing poverty reduction expenditures in poor countries. In other words, many of the poorest in the poor countries are being left behind. These challenges have not been matched by a commensurate increase in available official development assistance. There are indications that official financial flows to developing countries have experienced a small decline or stagnated at best since the beginning of the pandemic due to tight fiscal conditions in rich countries. Your Excellencies, Honorable Minister, distinguished delegates, as a platform, it is important that we are self-critical of ourselves. We must be able to admit where we have not made progress and congratulate ourselves where we have. We have made great progress in applying the whole society approach in our work. We now have foundations actively involved in playing their role in the realization of development effectiveness for those most left behind at the local and at the national level. At the same time, we have made great progress in bringing the private sector in the ambit of development effectiveness. The Kampala Principal Assessment Metrics remain one of the most important tools for holding private sector accountable for their development effectiveness. I want indeed to congratulate the leadership of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation for continuously challenging itself into making this platform a truly unique platform, the only one of its kind where everybody is invited to the table on an equal footing. At the same time, it is important that we note that the evidence on the ground shows that a lot more is needed to realize the Busan Partnership principles. The efforts to resolve the unfinished business of Paris and Accra is quickly losing momentum, and much more progress is needed on fulfilling democratic ownership, inclusive partnerships, and transparency and accountability. Civic spaces at the country level continue to shrink, and enabling environment for civil society organizations, parliament, foundations, and trade unions to fulfill their effectiveness mandate remains elusive in most countries. There are reports showing that there's continued physical attack and politically motivated curtailment of their spaces of work and mandate. These steps do not build trust but erode them. This summit, therefore, comes at a very critical juncture. Unlike the past, where the focus was on monitoring progress report, it seeks to address a very basic yet important element in any partnership: trust. However, trust requires that we are reliable, that we are honest with each other, and have strong political will to do what we dare not do, and are open to frank and open discussions. I hope that in the next 3 days, we will prove that we are trustworthy, not only here in this room and elsewhere in the world, but also to the millions of lives which we seek to impact. Guided by objectives of promotion of development and poverty reduction, development cooperation has the only potential of translating the emerging development challenges and priorities into better and lasting results for those most left behind. Parliament, civil society organizations, foundations, trade unions, and local authorities and private sector have a comprehensive and yet a very complex mandate in development. We need to be deliberate in how we include them in different ways, both at local and national ecosystem of development. In this regard, creating an enabling environment will be critical. We must be ready to reform the way we engage, the way we build partnership, the way we account each other, and realize the results. Our institutions, processes, and policies must be ready for a new form of partnership, which is built on result. We must also be ready to invest in rebuilding the trust that has waned over the years due to our own acts of omission and commission. As non-executive actors, we remain committed to this cause and hope that our invested trust will result into better enabling conditions to help us realize our own effectiveness as we serve the citizens. I know it will not happen automatically, but with the deliberate and targeted actions, we must put the GPDC platform in a new trajectory. The trajectory that will restore trust of hundreds of millions of poor people who depend in our change of behavior for their sustainable livelihoods. We have no option but to start a new path and a renewed trust. For this, ladies and gentlemen, four things need to happen rather. One, we must commit to behavior change consistent with commitments already made since the era of Paris Declaration. We must take action to address the new and emerging challenges, including those of climate finance that have been well elaborated in the outcome document. We must reaffirm the integrity of effectiveness agenda centered on the principles of democratic ownership, inclusive partnership, focus on the results, transparency, and mutual accountability. We must commit and sign up to the new monitoring framework as the only way that we can hold each other accountable. We need to create genuine multi-stakeholder dialogue and partnership at the global, regional, and national level in order to secure country action for domestication of the effectiveness agenda. Lastly, we need to provide enabling environment for all the non-executive constituencies in order to be effective in their own areas of work. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important to note that the trust that we seek to build is not for ourselves, but to restore the trust of our people that they have lost in the effectiveness of development cooperation. We must put people back at the center of development. We must build sustainable partnership with them, and we must rely on them to tell us whether we are successful or not. The challenge for these 3 days is for us to realize that. I thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Meja, indeed, for that call for trust, transparency, and political will. It's now my pleasure to be joined remotely by Priyanti Fernando, who is the Executive Director of the International Women's Rights Action Watch. Priyanti, we've heard from all of our speakers that, of course, we're not on track for the SDGs. Tell us very briefly what that means for the women in the Global South.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you. Good evening from my heart of the world to everybody in the room. I wish the women who I work with were here to talk for themselves, but since they are not, I think what I have learned with my work with them is that it means that their lives become more impoverished and harder, that they continue to become even more disadvantaged and discriminated against when it comes to the protection and fulfillment of their rights. And gender equality becomes a very distant dream. Women need food, health, education, decent work, water and sanitation, a clean environment, etc., which are what the SDGs are about. So not achieving each of these goals means that goal 5, which is about achieving gender equality, is also compromised.
How important is it that women have a voice at the decision-making table?
Well, of course, it's very important, right? I think it's very, very important that women have a voice at decision-making tables, and we've been talking about this for a long time. It's happening, albeit rather slowly. And I think there are 2 very good examples here already on stage, Moldova and Rwanda. But I think what is just as or even more important than women sitting at decision-making tables is that the voices of women in vulnerable situations are heard, and that the spaces in which decisions are made are not, dare I say, patriarchal or just dismissive of women's lived experience, especially the lived experience of women who experience multiple forms of discrimination. In South Asia, we have seen many women heads of states and many women in decision-making places. South Asia is where I come from. I'm from Sri Lanka, but that hasn't necessarily translated into a better deal for women on the ground. And what we try to do in Euro-Asia Pacific is to create spaces for women to articulate their demands. So every year we organize what we call the Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development. And it's held regionally when we could hold it physically, but more recently we've been holding it online on different thematics like environmental justice or women worker rights. But it's not always that decision makers accept our invitations to come to those spaces that we organize. They prefer to have more tokenistic representation of Southern women's voices in the spaces they organize and they convene. And so they lose, I think, many opportunities to really know what women's demands are or what women on the ground really want.
Priyanti, thank you. A point very well made about the fact that it's a two-way exchange indeed that's needed. So tell us, the national governments, what would you like them to do to get these SDGs back on track?
I think as Global South women, we would like to see our national governments change their priorities. I think all national governments have committed themselves to the SDGs, as we've been talking, and most of them have signed up to human rights conventions that underpin the SDGs. So being off track on achieving the SDGs means that they have also failed in their obligations under international law to protect the rights of all their citizens, including, of course, the rights of women. So right to food, right to education, right to health, right to decent work, etc. In this, we've just had a lot of talk about the importance of trust, but not protecting citizens' rights is a clear way, I think, of breaking some of the trust that we as Global South women have in our governments. So I think what we would demand is that when states are making these economic policies, when they are thinking of implementing austerity measures or reducing taxation, or when they're thinking of heavily investing in the military or providing incentives to transnational corporations, that they check how these policies and these budgetary allocations impact on achieving the SDGs and protecting the rights of their citizens. I think that means that you have to be courageous enough to make some really hard choices and challenge these global institutions that I think often try to ignore or downplay state obligations to be accountable to their citizens, not just their debtors, right?
Priyanti, very briefly, because time is not our friend, the international community, the so-called international community, what would you like to see them do more of?
So for me, the so-called international community, it's a sort of an euphemism for global North governments, right? And I think the Deputy Secretary General of the UN outlined some very important elements of what could be effective global North and South partnerships. But I think basically global North government should be doing a lot more than they are making sure than they are doing right now to make sure that SDGs and human rights are not undermined in the global South. And this means, there are many things, but one of the things is that they need to keep to their own extraterritorial obligations, where many of the women's groups that I'm working with are now calling out global North governments against abuses to workers in their companies, in their transnational companies, for blocking the TRIPS waiver and access to COVID vaccines, for creating tax havens that facilitate illicit financial flows and all of that. So that's one thing. The second thing is the global North governments serve on the decision-making bodies of all these international institutions whose policies are often detrimental to the achievement of the SDGs and human rights. So there is a role to be played in kind of influencing that.
And thirdly, very briefly, Priyanti, because time is not our friend.
Yes, okay, I'll just finish, right? So the other thing is that I think they need to kind of resolve some of the contradictions of selling arms and profiting by arms and creating geopolitical areas of conflict, which I think people talked about. And also the fact that you can't really silo SDGs, human rights, macroeconomic policies, trade regimes, etc. I think they're all working in separate spaces. They need to be able to brought together and enables Southern governments and all governments not to pull in different directions.
Thank you so much for so concisely in the given time getting your point of view across. Thank you, Priyanti. Much appreciated. And I'm sure you can hear the round of applause from our audience. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to announce that Indonesia and Sweden are to take up the important positions of co-chairs of the Global Partnership. Indonesia, as you know, recently held a very successful G20 meeting in Bali, and I'd like to ask Indonesia's Minister of National Development Planning, Suharto Monoarfa, to tell us about Indonesia's vision and ambition as the country takes up this very important position. Sir, the lectern is yours.
His Excellency Mr. Ignazio Cassis, President of the Swiss Confederation, Excellency Ms. Maya Sandu, President of Moldova, Excellencies Mr. Paul Kagame, President of Rwanda and Chair of NEPAD, Excellency Ms. Amina Mohammed, United Nations Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, Honorable Co-Chairs, Steering Committee, and the Joint Support Team, the representative of non-state actors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to send our gratitude for the trust given to the Republic of Indonesia to be the co-chair representing countries with dual roles, and we send our congratulations to Sweden for continuing the Swiss co-chairmanship. We truly hope that together with the other co-chairs, Democratic Republic of the Congo and Reality of Aid Africa, we would optimize global partnership for effective development cooperation as the primary multi-stakeholder vehicle in driving the achievement of development effectiveness. Since the beginning, Indonesia has been actively involved in establishing a global architecture on effective development cooperation through multi-stakeholder partnership and private sector participation, including within the South-South and Triangular Cooperation framework. Indonesia has stipulated effective development cooperation as a priority in our national development policy, and it remains highly relevant as an enabler for our economic transformation. The GPEDC principles have guided us, our national development result, to meet international standards. We believe that international development cooperation that is based on country ownership, evidence-based planning, and integrated involvement of various stakeholders are essential to promote a development that is sustainable and tailored to each country's needs. Effort to promote international development cooperation resonates with Indonesia's G20 presidency. At the G20 Development Ministerial meeting in Belitung, Indonesia, the ministers called for reinvigorated multilateralism amidst the multiple crises and mutually reinforcing global challenges. We are on the same page that multilateralism is not an option, but necessity in the achievement of more equitable, more resilient, and more sustainable world. Therefore, the ministers have agreed on the G20 roadmap for stronger recovery and resilience in developing countries and G20 principles to scale up blended finance in developing countries. Following the spirit of collaboration and cooperation, we hope that during our co-chairmanship, we can strengthen the mechanism, including by providing tools to strengthen and scale up the existing mechanism that was already established in our G20 presidency and continuing our commitment to the GPEDC Outcome Document 2022. We also welcome other initiatives that can strengthen our commitment and collaborative effort to international development cooperation. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we wish for the support from all stakeholders in the GPEDC to collaborate in implementing effective development cooperation commitments and generate innovative ideas to bring back on track and even to accelerate the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And Indonesia, as the active players in the Global South, stand ready to host the next effective development cooperation meeting. I do thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. And I would now like to give the floor to Sweden, which, as many of you know, will have the presidency of the European Union next year. And please welcome Sweden's State Secretary for International Development Cooperation, Diana Janse.
Presidents of Switzerland, Rwanda, Moldova, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for welcoming Sweden's incoming co-chair in the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, and we thank you for the trust put in us. Although the actual handover will take place at the end of the summit, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the outgoing chairs, Bangladesh and Switzerland, for their efforts in the past 3 years. I would also like to welcome Indonesia as co-chair. We are very much looking forward to working together in the coming years along with other co-chairs, the joint support team, and all of you, the members. It is true that the global scene is changing. We only have a few more years to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals as well as fulfilling the Paris Declaration. At the same time, the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the COVID pandemic has placed an enormous strain on the international system. We struggle with war and conflict, and with the impact of war and conflict in various parts of the world. The democratic space is shrinking. The humanitarian needs are greater than ever. Meanwhile, a slowing global economy and soaring prices makes funding even more challenging. Official development assistance is an important and strategic resource, but it will not be sufficient to meet all global needs on its own. We also operate in a more complex and increasingly polarized world. One example is Ukraine, where Russia, by its aggression, not only is causing death, destruction, and suffering in Ukraine, but also has fueled a global food insecurity situation with victims across the world, not least on the Horn of Africa. Another is a desperate situation in Afghanistan, where basic needs cannot be met by humanitarian assistance only, but where development cooperation is anywhere from extremely difficult to politically impossible. As funding is limited, development resources must be used effectively, and for the right purpose. In this regard, addressing corruption and its negative effects on development must always be a priority. Corruption reduces trust in public institutions. It limits effective use of resources, During our presidency of the EU next year, we intend to focus on the EU's work against corruption as a development obstacle. We also need to increase available funding beyond ODA. For this, we need new partnerships. We need the private sector, we need philanthropists, we need new ways of solving both old and new problems. We need to continue to be innovative and entrepreneurial. How can, for example, the opportunities of digitalization be tapped even more for development? Where is the next new effective instrument like guarantees? The principles of effective development cooperation, ownership, focus on results, inclusive partnerships, accountability and transparency remains valid. But as the context is changing, we must view the principles through a new and sharper lens. The principles must fit reality. Governments have the primary responsibility to deliver for its citizen and should always be held accountable. We cannot make reality fit our principles. While we all agree that the principle of ownership includes the partner country government, it is also clear that it stretches beyond and involves a variety of local actors and partnerships. And how can we still ensure effectiveness in what we do where there is no legitimate government to partner with, as in Afghanistan? When it comes to results, we simply must do better. The fact that, in quite a few instances, we are still engaged in development cooperation work in the same countries as we started supporting some 60 years ago is evident of that something is not working. For that, we have a shared responsibility. Yes, the challenges are more and more complex, but our efforts still need to show clear results. We are here together, laying the groundwork for a more relevant and stronger development cooperation, contributing to addressing the challenges in today's world. Sweden will continue taking this work forward in cooperation with all of you. I am certain that this meeting will provide important input to that end. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much indeed. And I would like to thank all of our speakers indeed for their commitment to transforming the way we work together. A few housekeeping points. You've mentioned the outcome document. Please do go and have a look on it online. And the app is very important. If you want to ask questions during the moderated discussion, you will need to go on the app. If you want some fun, you can go to the interactive SDG booth and have your video and photo taken. But most probably what's more important at this time is that at 14:45 you come back here to listen to a very important first session on the effective financing of climate adaptation that we know is so important since COP27. But before that, please, lunch is served, so bon appétit. Thank you.